Hello everyone, welcome to our fourth video lecture for our social research methods for sports studies class. And for this lecture, we will talk about identifying and articulating the research problem. And we've discussed about this before, that this is usually the first step in our research process. So we will talk about a short overview of the quantitative research designs, identifying the research problem, and then also identifying and determining the variables to be used in the study, stating the research problem, and articulating the research hypothesis. So we will be discussing this in more detail when we go to the methodology part of our course, but for the meantime, I would like to give you a brief overview about the two major research designs in the quantitative methods. So the first general design is called an experimental or an interventional study. When we say that a study is experimental, it means that in that research, the researcher introduces an intervention, like for example, a program or an educational intervention, a seminar, or a social experiment, and see whether or not it's going to be affecting a certain variable among the subjects or the participants in the study. So an example for this would be, for example, you want to increase the motivation of student athletes, and you are going to introduce a new, for example, a new motivational seminar program to them. So you're going to see whether or not that seminar program will be able to increase the quantitative measures of motivation. So that's an example of an experimental or an interventional study. So the key here is that the study is going to examine the effect of an intervention that has been applied or has been conducted by the researcher. And then the second general quantitative research is a non-experimental or observational research design. So a non-experimental research design, unlike experimental research design, there is no intervention that is being introduced by the researcher. Rather, the researcher just simply observes or measures one or more phenomena as operationalized by variables in the population and statistically analyze the relationship. So for example, you want to see whether or not a variable A influences the variable B, and what you're going to do is measure variable A and measure variable B separately, and then you're going to statistically measure their relationship. Then that's an example of an observational study or non-experimental study. In that study, the researcher does not introduce any intervention, any program, any treatment, any product, any modality, etc. Now, for example, you want to see whether or not physical fitness will increase the student engagement of the student. So what the researcher will do is to measure the physical fitness of the individuals involved in the study, and at the same time also measure their student engagement. And then after measuring them and quantifying these measures, they're going to use the statistical tools in order to see whether or not these variables are related to each other. Okay, so that is an example of a non-experimental observational studies. Under experimental and under observational, there are more specific types of research designs, but we will talk about them in later when we go to methodology. And also, for your information, for the undergraduate level in the behavioral sciences department, we usually make use of non-experimental, observational, or descriptive studies. So we don't usually do research that will introduce an experiment or an intervention. So we simply just make use of social research methods to measure two variables in their natural state using quantifiable methods, and then we make use of statistics to measure them or to relate them, to test the relationships. Now, as we explained, a research problem is the beginning of a research study. So we think of a research topic and then we develop that into a research problem that we are going to address in the future when we are already collecting our data, analyzing our data, and then generating answers. Alright, so what is a research problem? It is the articulation of the inquiry of the research based on an identified knowledge gap. So it's very important that the research problem that you are asking or that you are stating in your specific research proposal should be something that presents a knowledge gap. Meaning, when you immerse yourself into the literature, these are still areas that are still unclear or inconsistent in terms of the findings and the truths that are established. No, so this is the knowledge gap that we want to address in the study. Now, how do researchers look for research problems? Now, there are many sources of research problems. One could be, of course, experience. And I think most of you, and the way you identify your research topics in our earlier sessions, this is your inspiration based from the experiences. That's why the reason why most of you had COVID-19 as their research topic, because that is what you're currently experiencing at the moment. So usually, most of the details or most of the questions that we ask are based from some of the problems and the knowledge gaps that we see within our practice and within our environment. But also, more importantly, we also should be able to find problems in the research literature. So when you try to look at the studies that have been done before, you're going to see what other areas have not yet been studied, or what are the other areas that no consensus seem to be emergent yet, and you want to do a research in order to contribute to answering that specific research question, and that's very important. I think being able to identify a research topic based from your own experiences and based on your immediate environment is as important as looking for research within what is available and not available in the literature or in the available studies at the moment. Because it is very important, you always have to remember that the research problem should be based on or should be addressing a knowledge gap. And you will not know the knowledge gap in the certain field of or area of the study that you are getting into if you haven't really skimmed or if you haven't really immersed yourself in the literature yet. So, in the process of developing your problems, and I will repeat this in this lecture multiple times, you really have to do a lot of reading. You really have to do a lot of searching in the literature to really see whether or not the questions you are asking are really what we would call a researchable question or a researchable problem. Next, you can also look into what social issues that may not be your personal experience, but you have read in an article, or you have read in the news, or you have had secondary experiences with, and probably that's the reason why some of you had research in relation to mental health, because you know that there are laws and programs and policies that are now being created for mental health, and you want to see how that applies to sports people, and probably that's the reason also why you want to also look into diversity and multiculturalism within sports teams, because that is also a trend in what we mostly see in sports teams nowadays. So this can also be inspirations for your research problems. Another inspiration for or source of research problems is a theory. So probably you know a theory and you want to test out whether that theory really will be able to help explain certain relationships in the variables that you want to be testing out. Like, for example, you want to see whether or not, children or child athletes or young athletes are able to meet their needs in order for them to have good sports performance. You can probably analyze the needs based on a theory, and if you remember Abraham Maslow's theory of needs satisfaction, so probably you can deduce needs into the 5 needs of Maslow's, which is physiological, safety and security, love and belongingness, self-esteem, and self-actualization. So I hope you remember this specific theory. So this could be the basis. But of course, some research proposals may not necessarily be strictly based on a theory, but my suggestion always, a good research problem should at least be embedded in one way or another to a theoretical framework. So later on, we will learn about theoretical frameworks, we will learn about conceptual frameworks, and it's very important that the relationships between variables that we are testing in the study, they are theoretically sound, or they could be theoretically explained. And of course, you can also do research based on or from the ideas of external sources. Probably you have a manager or a teacher or your coach wants you to study about a certain thing that you want to evaluate, because this is something that's important for the team or for the institution. Then that could also be something that you could do. But this is the least, because if this is not coming from your own motivation, then your interest might not be very much attached to that study. So I wouldn't say that this is the best source of a research problem. So there you go. These are the 5 sources of research problems. You can get it from experience. You can and you should get ideas from the literature. You can also be inspired by possible or emerging social issues around the field of area of study or your own experiences. You can also base your research problems to a present theory, and you can also get ideas from external sources. And now, how do we develop and refine research problems? And probably you've heard of this a lot of times before. When you were still in high school, you first select a broad topic or area. And this is what we already did in one of our assignments. I asked you to look for a specific area or research topic that you want to explore on. What could be the main phenomenon that you want to address or explore in the study. And for example, you want to study about, what are the things that can improve sport performance, or probably another broad topic or area would be emotional health of athletes, or probably you just want to study about a new and emerging field of sports, which is esports. So that is how we start trying to dig into the problem. So we try to find a broad area first, and that's the reason why we did our exercise earlier during this course. And then you probably have heard of this phrase before: you narrow down the topic. So how do you narrow down the topic? By asking questions that helps focus the inquiry. And usually we ask for precedents, or antecedents of the phenomenon that you are asking, like what are the factors that contribute to, and you also talk about consequences of the phenomenon that you are looking at. So we're talking about quantitative here. So you're looking at the antecedents, or the things that come before or cause the phenomenon or the topic that you are identifying, and its consequences, the effects or the outcomes of that specific phenomenon. Remember that the broad topic or area that you are proposing to study must be imagined as a phenomenon. And of course, since this is sports studies, it has to be imagined as a social concept or a social phenomenon, right? Or a behavioral phenomenon. Right? So for example, sports performance, that's a behavioral phenomenon. Emotional health is a social phenomenon. Esports is also a social phenomenon. So you have to think about that, that when we talk about sports studies, usually we explore social phenomenon. Of course, we can also explore more hard sciences like biological. Like for example, you want to see whether or not about what are the things that affects muscle strength. But at least in terms of sports studies, we are more gearing on the social sciences. So we always think about that when we try to generate research problems for our thesis. So for example, your broad topic or your field of study or your phenomenon that you want to study is the emotional well-being of athletes. So first, you have to identify the antecedents or the factors that may affect how that specific phenomenon plays out. So probably after brainstorming with your group mates, you are able to identify that probably antecedents to this emotional well-being of athletes may be socio-demographic profile, right? So we know that based on the age, the gender, the civil status, the religion of the participants, this may be things that influence the participants' emotional well-being. And actually, in most quantitative social research, we consider this as antecedents of most of our main phenomenon. And probably you have another one that you consider as an antecedent to this phenomenon, and probably that's social support. So the social support received by a person may also influence or be an antecedent or a factor to a person's emotional well-being. So probably while doing this brainstorming, or this ideation or conceptualization of the research problem, you can also already graph your basic assumptions by putting arrows between the phenomena or the concepts that you are trying to measure in the study or trying to relate in the study. And then you also think about possible outcomes of your phenomenon, which is emotional well-being. So what could be a possible outcome for emotional well-being? Probably that can influence a player's motivation to win. So there. And probably it can also influence the athlete's sports performance. Right? So again, in order for us to be able to visualize our conceptualization, we can also draw arrows on the concepts of our study. So what we call this sort of diagram or visualization of the different concepts that we want to connect with our main phenomenon, we call this a conceptual schema or a conceptual paradigm. And basically, this will be our kind of visualization or sort of draft that will help us or guide us in terms of articulating the problems later. Here's another example. So, for instance, the main phenomenon that we want to study is perceived physical fitness. So why do we put perceived here? Because if we just say physical fitness, the assumption is that we're going to measure physical fitness like in a more biological, medical way. Like we will ask the person to run and whether you see how the speed, the endurance, and probably in social research that's not going to be so easy to do. So we're just using, we have the qualifier perceived because we want to ensure here that the physical fitness is based on the participants or the respondents' own appraisal of their own physical fitness. So that's our main phenomenon. So perceived physical fitness. So based probably on your brainstorming and readings, these are the things that you think are antecedents or factors to perceive physical fitness. Social demographic characteristics, like I said, this is is present in almost all social research. You always have to put this because, like I said, like we know, of course, the sociological variables and economic variables may be contributory to a lot of the social realities that we have. And then, of course, we have household characteristics. For example, these are children. So, for example, our participants in this study are children, for example, or adolescents, like SHS students, So, the parents, the type of family of the child, in terms of, household size, right? The income level of the family, the characteristics of the mother, the characteristics of the father may have an influence on the person's fitness, physical fitness. And then also the nutritional status of the adolescent, may also influence the person's, physical fitness. So this could be possible antecedents or factors for perceived physical fitness. And then the outcomes, could be, for example, in the context of school, perceived physical fitness can improve extracurricular involvement. So that could be something that you can measure as an outcome of perceived physical fitness. And also, another could be life satisfaction. And you've seen this in the sample research that I have, prescribed to you before. That, sports expectations, sports engagement are predictors or antecedents of life satisfaction. So this is another example of a conceptual schema of how you can really kind of conceptualize the research problem, and probably this will help you pin down the things that you need to study, and the things that you need to study are found in the boxes, and the relationships that you need to test, and the relationships you need to test are signified by the arrows in the study. Now the question, how many antecedents or how many outcomes or how many factors or how many outcomes do we need to test? Do we need to find and attach to our main phenomenon and study with the main phenomenon? Of course, you always have to make sure of the feasibility and the researchability, in choosing the antecedents and or the factors and the outcomes. There should be both logical explanations, and at the same time there should be good research literature support, why you are putting them as factors and as outcomes. Second, you also have to think about the feasibility. What I mean is, of course, you can put 5, 10 for each side, but of course that will be difficult because that will elongate or extend the number of items that you need to put in your survey tool, if the survey is going to be your instrument. So usually for an undergrad research, the doable is around 2 to 3 here or 1 to 2 here, in the outcomes, But of course, you have one main phenomenon wherein, your ideas, and your tests will revolve around. Next caveat, so like I explained earlier, that in terms of narrowing the topic, you have to do this, you have to look at antecedents, you have to look at outcomes, you have to look at the contexts of the phenomenon. Like you also have to think about who are going to be your participants or subjects or respondents in the study. You also have to think about these things, to narrow the topic. But at the same time, it is not just, thinking about it, brainstorming, you and your group mates just, throwing your ideas around. More importantly, after this process of doing this schema and trying to lay down all of the concepts that you need to study in your research, you have to confirm the relationships that you are trying to suggest in that conceptual schema, in your conceptualization, using literature review. And through literature review, you will learn more about the phenomenon, and probably it will help you further refine your problems and variables. Like, are these really the good antecedents for us to study, or probably there are other antecedents that we can study, as suggested by the literature? Or if we are really going to study about social demographics, which social demographics should we include? Is religion a relevant social demographic variable that we need to include? Which should be included, which should we not include? The literature will tell us that. Also, the literature will also tell us about the theoretical explanations, for the relationships that you're trying to test. Now, how do we know if a research problem is good? Well, it's good when you are presenting something new or something novel, and it's relevant or significant to the times. Like, for example, if you say, I want to know whether or not motivation will increase sports performance, I don't think that's an exciting or a good research problem at the moment, because there are so many research that have already established the relationship between motivation and positive behavioral outcomes. So I wouldn't put that as a novel research problem. So this is going to be one of your challenges. It has to be something that is not a clearly established truth yet, as suggested by voluminous research. So you have to look into possible studies that have not yet been fully explored in the literature. That's why it's important for you to do a very thorough literature review, because you want to know the areas of the field of study that has not been fully explored yet. Next is the researchability of the problem, because you want to make sure that the variables that you are measuring are really measurable, because there are certain variables that it may be difficult for you to measure based on your abilities, like for example, you want to measure like I said, physical fitness, like actual physical fitness. You want to measure endurance, but probably you don't have the competence to measure speed, endurance, flexibility, because these are very biological, medical aspects. So I wouldn't say that's a researchable problem, because the variables you're not competent to measure the variables that you want to measure in the study, And of course, the feasibility of addressing the problem, like the time, the resources to be used. Like for example, there used to be a student who approached me and said they want to study about scouting experiences of agents, and there's only very few agents, and it's hard to really pin them down and find them and do a survey among them, because they're all over the place, because they're scouting. So the feasibility is not so high, when you want to do those kinds of studies, especially in a quantitative research that needs high sample size. So you have to think about these things. Will time allow you? Will resources allow you? Will you have administrative clearance for you to do the study, right? For example, you want to do a study among PBA players or National League players, and you don't have access to them, so that won't be a feasible study. So you can think about that study, but you will not be able to do that study because it's not feasible for you. And also, you have to think about the ethics, and we have discussed that in the previous lecture. And it has to be an ethical research. You have to follow all the ethical considerations in designing your research. And more importantly, the research that you are proposing should be of interest to you, because this is going to be the drive that you will have in order for you to continue your research, because research is quite a painstaking, it's quite a difficult, complex process. I wouldn't lie. As a researcher myself, doing research, you really have to be very passionate, because there are going to be a lot of barriers along the way. And if you're not interested enough in what you're studying, it's easier for you to be demotivated and give up and probably just accept failure. You will be going through a lot of panel defenses, and some panel members will really evaluate and criticize your study, and if you're not interested enough, it will really dishearten you. So I really want you to look into studies that really have an interest in you, that you have kind of an emotional and a very big attachment to, so that you really are going to be fueled to finish the study. Now, in quantitative research, the concepts and the phenomena that we are studying are called variables. So this is how we articulate phenomena and concepts in quantitative research. So earlier, in our schema here, in our paradigm, these things in squares, in rectangles, these are called your variables. And what is important in identifying variables is that they should be quantifiable. So later, in our methodology section, we should be able to know how to measure them via numbers, how to quantify them. How do we measure age through numbers? How do we measure physical fitness through numbers? How do we measure nutritional status through numbers? Now, there are ways to do it, Even, when you talk about attitudes, or when you talk about feelings, or when you talk about well-being, and quality of life. This may sound, this can be socially subjective, but in quantitative research there is that effort to make it more objective by quantifying them, because it is only in quantifying these concepts and treating them as variables in a study will we be able to apply statistics, which will help us in terms of trying to test the relationships that we want to test. So they have to be transformed into numbers or measurable components or categories. So as I explained, variables are quantifiable forms of the concept that are being studied, and it's a characteristic or quality that takes on different values that varies from one person to the next. Kaya nga variable, no? That's the reason why it's quite variable, because we expect it to vary from one person to another. But of course, they should be measured the same way. And of course, they might, express that measurement in different ways, but still, quantifiable. Now, this is a textbook information that I hope you know by now, that there are two major types of variables that you always have to remember in terms of their relationship to each other. And these are independent variables, or we will call them always, in the rest of the until the end of the time, we'll call it IV. And this is the presumed cause of a dependent variable. So the presumed cause is the independent variable, and in a relationship, the presumed effect is what we call a dependent variable, or a DV. All right, so that's very important for you to remember. So going back here in this schema, all right, so we are assuming that the socio-demographic profile or characteristic is the IV, and the perceived physical fitness is the DV. In this relationship, the IV is the socio-demographic profile, and the DV is your perceived physical fitness. So we are assuming that certain age or certain sex or gender or certain, economic status have an influence or can be attributes to perceived physical fitness. Same thing with household characteristics. They can cause, or they are causes of physical fitness or attributes to physical fitness, and then also nutritional status. But in the context of the relationship of perceived physical fitness to extracurricular involvement and perceived physical fitness with life satisfaction, all right, so this now becomes our IV, the perceived physical fitness, and the outcome measures now is your dependent variable. So you always have to remember and of course, aside from causal relationships, you also have to look at temporal relationship, which goes first than the other, So that's why this one is your IV, because this one we expect to be measured or to be apparent first before this one, And same thing here, This should be apparent first before this one. Okay? So independent versus dependent variable. So here are just other types of variables. So we have moderating variable. So moderating variable changes the strength or direction of an effect between two variables, the independent variable and the dependent variable. So for example, in this specific schema, we see that sports spectation is the independent variable, and we are assuming that it can influence or be related to happiness. All right? However, we can add one more variable because we feel like this relationship can be changed when another variable is present. And for example, team identification, or for example, if you are watching a team that you are rooting for, it can influence that effect. It can probably increase the relationship or make the relationship more positive, when you are watching your team. Right? And this team identification is called your moderating variable. Next, we have what we call a mediating variable or an intervening variable. It is a variable that links the independent and the dependent variables and whose existence explains the relationship between other two variables. So basically, this is a linking variable between the IV and the DV, just in case we want to see an extra link. So I'll try to draw that model for you. So for instance, in trying to relate health consciousness with physical well-being, we can probably assume that people who are more health conscious will most likely be physically well. So the independent variable in this case is your health consciousness, and the dependent variable in this case is your physical well-being. However, there may be another pathway, that wherein health consciousness can affect, that goes first before going to physical well-being. Probably, for example, eating habits. Right? So probably we can explain that the reason why health consciousness improves physical well-being is because people who are more health conscious may have more positive eating habits, and people who have positive eating habits may have an increased physical well-being. And these eating habits, the variables tries to explain the pathway between the independent variable and the dependent variable is what we call a mediating or an intervening variable. Alright? So the difference between a moderating and a mediating variable, changes the magnitude of the IV and the DV relationship. But for mediating variable, it tries to explain the pathway between the IV and the DV. But you are not expected in your research to be able to test a moderating or a mediating variable, because that's quite, higher for a higher research studies usually done by master students. So, these are just, these are conceptual things that you need to know for the exam, but you are not expected to do this in your actual thesis. Now, you will also be hearing sometimes the term extraneous variables. So remember, the extraneous variables are things that you will not measure in your study. But these are characteristics of the situation or of the person that might influence either the independent variable or the dependent variable. So an extraneous variable refers to any variables that you are not intentionally studying or cannot study because of reasons of cost or difficulty. Researchers must be aware of this, and if they can, must control them in the study. So for example, you're doing an experiment wherein you want to see the effectiveness of a sex education seminar in order to increase contraceptive use. But you have to remember that when you are testing your seminar and trying to measure whether or not they are going to be eventually using their contraceptives for when they engage in sexual behavior, you have to understand that, the outcome for the contraceptive use may not be directly related to the sex education seminar, and there may be other things that can influence it. Like, for example, someone might have already watched a documentary or an educational video prior to your seminar, or probably they have already been, learning this from their peers, or they watched this in TV before even your seminar comes out. So their previous exposure outside of your own intervention of interest are called extraneous variables, and therefore you must be aware that they are present and must be able to analyze your findings in the context of the presence of these extraneous variables. And if you can, you might need to control them. Only if you can, of course. So now that you have pinned down the basic relationships that you want to test in the study and the variables that you want to test in the study, it's time for you to write the statement of the problem. So just a few descriptions of the statement of the problem. It should be able to identify the nature, the context, and the significance of the problem being addressed, should be broad enough to include central concerns, and should be narrow enough to serve as a guide to study design. Other characteristics for quantitative research, the statement of the problem should be able to identify the study variables in the study. That's why when you try to think about the research problem or the statement of the problem, you already have to have identified your concepts, your variables, and the relationships that you need to test. So identifies the relationship among those variables. You already should know who is your population, who are your population of interest, and you are going to make use of verbs that will signify that you are doing a quantitative study. And usually, the verbs that we use is the transitive to describe, to determine, to test, to compare. Usually what we use is to identify or to determine or to test. That's what we usually use for observational studies. All right? Because there are certain verbs that are very much qualitative, like for example, to explore, to understand. So those are more qualitative in nature. So the verbs that we use in the statement of the problem will give the reader a clue that this is a quantitative study or a qualitative study. So let's just go back to this schema. I just removed the nutritional status because I feel like it's going to be very heavy if you're doing a research and you're going to measure that many variables. Is going to be too much. So I just removed that one. So we have demographic characteristics, household characteristics, perceived physical fitness as the main phenomenon, and then you have your extracurricular involvement and life satisfaction as your outcome variables. So now, in this conceptual schema, let's now articulate this into a statement of the problem. So here's our general statement of the problem. This study aims to describe the perceived physical fitness of senior high school students enrolled in a selected university in Manila. We don't say the locale usually, the name of the locale, because we want to keep privacy and confidentiality, if you remember our ethics discussion. And determine its relationships with socio-demographic profile, household characteristics, extracurricular involvement, and life satisfaction. So let's see if it follows the verb or the criteria that we have in our previous slide. So it says here, identifies key study variables. So let's see what are the variables based from our schema from earlier. Perceived physical fitness, if you remember, and then we have social demographic profile, household characteristics, extracurricular involvement, and then life satisfaction. Next, it should be able to identify the possible relationships among variables. So did we articulate that? Yes, determining its relationship. So it's there. Next, we say whether or not it indicates the population of interest. Did it indicate? Yes, it did. Senior high school students enrolled in a selected university in Manila. So yes, we did identify it there. And then did it use the correct verb? So it says here to describe. Alright, so we said here it's to describe. So it's correct. And to determine, it's also here. Alright, so this is what we call the general statement of the problem. This is the first part of the statement of the problem. It's usually articulated in a declarative form. The second part and the more analytic part of the statement of the problem are the research questions. So these are interrogative question form statements that inquire about the analytical components needed to be answered or accomplished in order to answer the main problem or the general statement of the problem. So first part, you should be able to describe each variable that is that you are including in your study, that you placed in your conceptual schema from earlier, and then you should be able to ask queries about the relationship among the variables, right? So let's see how we are going to do that. So this study aims to describe the perceived physical fitness of senior high school students enrolled in a selected university in Manila and determine its relationships with socio-demographic profile, household characteristics, extracurricular involvement, and life satisfaction. If you remember, this was our main research statement of the problem or general statement of the problem. And then we have a sort of clause, that we usually have in between the general statement of the problem and the research questions, and this is that. More specifically, this study aims to answer the following questions. All right. So, again, what did we say? It should be able to ask the analytical components, and the first analytical components must be the variables that we are going to describe or determine in the study as suggested by our conceptual schema. So, we have here, what are the social demographic characteristics of SHS students selected in a selected university in Manila? What are the household characteristics of the respondents. Number 3, what is the level of perceived physical fitness? And then number 4, what is their level of extracurricular involvement? And then number 5, what is their level of life satisfaction? As you can see, this, we have to answer this first, right? So this, that's the first question, second question, third question, fourth question, fifth question. So those were our first analytical components described. Then, after that, you have to now address the relationships being tested. That's the next analytical component. So after you found out the values for each, you now have to relate them statistically. And the relations are found here in the arrows of the study. But usually, we ask first the relationship between the factors or antecedents and the phenomenon, and then the main phenomenon to the outcomes. And then remember, in the relationship between antecedent and the phenomenon, the IV are your antecedents and your phenomenon is your DV. And in the relationship between the phenomenon and the outcomes, your IV is the phenomenon and the DV is your outcomes. So how do we ask that? In our statement of the problem, after the first 5 questions where we ask the value of each variable in the study. So this is the first 5, the first analytic components, the descriptives, and then we go to the inferentials or the test for the relationships. As you can see, we have to look first at the antecedent or factors, right? And then after that, and then the phenomenon, the main phenomenon. So you can see here, how is the perceived level of physical fitness related to socio-demographic and household characteristics? We put them together because they are the antecedents or the factors to our main phenomenon. And then we have another question, how is perceived level of physical fitness related with or correlated with extracurricular involvement and life satisfaction? If you remember in our schema, this is our outcomes, right? So, and now we have finished all our questions. And when we have answered all the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then we have addressed this major statement of the problem. So, like I will reiterate, these research questions are the analytic components that will help you answer or address the statement of the problem. And your answer to the statement, the general statement of the problem is your conclusion later in the study. And then, aside from stating the research problem in a quantitative research, you also have to state the hypothesis. So hypothesis in the scientific method, if you remember, is what we call an intelligent guess. But of course, in our research, in the research lingo, it is the prediction of the relationship between at least 2 variables in the study. So it must suggest a predicted relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable, right? So, for example, in this statement of the problem, what is the hypothesis? No, for example, how is the perceived level of physical fitness related with socio-demographic profile and household characteristics? So I will just articulate and then explain later. So it would be, there is no significant relationship between perceived level of physical fitness and socio-demographic profile and household characteristics. And then the second hypothesis is, there is no significant relationship between perceived level of physical fitness and extracurricular involvement and life satisfaction. So that is our hypothesis. So usually our hypothesis is it's aligned with the inferential questions of the study. So there are 3 typologies of hypothesis. First, we have simple versus complex hypothesis. So simple only involves 2 variables. So for example, there is no significant relationship between stress and sports motivation, right? And then when we say complex, so the second one is complex, which involves 3 or more variables. So for example, there is no significant relationship among stress, sports motivation, and sports performance. So 1, 2, 3. This one only 1, 2. Remember, you cannot make a hypothesis with just one variable because usually hypotheses, they are rearticulations of the relationships being tested, and there's no relationship when there's only one variable involved. So you have to have at least 2 variables. So next we have directional versus non-directional hypothesis. So non-directional hypothesis does not show any direction. So for example, there is no significant relationship between perceived coaching efficacy and sports performance. So IV, DV, but it doesn't say whether or not the IV increases or decreases the sports performance. It just, questions whether there is or there is no existence of the relationship. But for directional, it gives a guess or a prediction of the weight or the direction of the relationship. For example, there is a significant positive relationship between perceived coaching efficacy IV and sport performance DV. So it means that when perceived coaching efficacy is high, the sports performance is also high. Or another way of saying this is coaching efficacy will significantly increase sports performance. So coaching efficacy is IV, increasing sports performance is DV. Right? And it already is directional because it tells you that the independent variable will increase the performance. And the third typology is whether it's null or research hypothesis. So if it's null hypothesis, it predicts that there is no relationship. So when you see the word no, then it is a null or statistical hypothesis. Then a research or alternative hypothesis basically predicts that there is the existence of the relationship. So as seen here, there's a significant positive relationship between perceived coaching efficacy IV and then sports performance DV. And then coaching efficacy will significantly increase sports performance. This is also an alternative. And then also one indicator that it's null is that it's H0. That's the symbol is H0 for null, and then HA for alternative. So for our thesis conventions in BSD, we make use of complex hypotheses, we make use of non-directional hypotheses, and we also make use of null or statistical hypothesis. So in this lecture, you were able to be exposed to learnings in relation to basic quantitative research design, experimental versus non-experimental research, interventional versus observational research. You were also we also discussed about what research problems are, the sources of research problems, the characteristics of a good research problem. We also talked about how we identify and how we refine a problem, how to make a conceptual schema that will be able to help us, find the variables in terms of the antecedent or factors of a phenomenon of interest and its outcomes. And then we also learned about how we articulate or how we write the statement of the problem, the general statement of the problem followed by the research questions, and how it asks the descriptive questions first and then asks about the tests of relationship. And then we also learned about how to rearticulate the tests for relationship via hypothesis. And we also learned that we make use of complex non-directional null hypothesis.